I do believe that he believed that the devil was in him, but I also believe he enjoyed leveraging that as sensationalism. I'm DC.
And I'm Michael.
And you're listening to the Monster Guys podcast. Welcome to the Monster Guys podcast, part 2 of our series, Monsters Among Us, and tonight we're going to be speaking about a man who said, "I was born with the devil in me," Herman Webster Mudgett, more commonly known as HH Holmes. I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil one, standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since. HH Holmes. Perhaps one of the most depraved serial killers that we know of in modern history.
He's a different breed of serial killer, and I say that knowing that serial killers are all very depraved and all very wretched individuals at times, but he was a whole different class.
Yeah, and this after talking about Elizabeth Bathory last week, so we've got to go to a different level to describe him as such, but similar to Bathory, there's a lot of confusion about his life and about the cases that he was allegedly involved in. And we're going to get into some of that tonight, but there's one thing for sure is that this guy was the real thing. And there was no question about that. I think the only question was how far his reach was.
How far, how much, how many there were under his reach. It should be also noted that he is considered by some to be America's first serial killer.
Yep.
The term that they had back then was multiple murderer, so it wasn't quite the same, but looking back, a lot of people attribute him as being the first U.S. serial killer.
And the claims are anywhere from 27 to 28 murders all the way up into the hundreds. Some say over 200 murders. Some say that it goes way beyond that because there's just no way of knowing everything that he did, particularly in the locations that he did it.
Yeah, if hundreds sounds extreme for the 1800s, we're going to get into why that is actually possible with the so-called murder castle.
The murder castle. That's just so bizarre that somebody constructs architecture for the purpose of murdering people en masse.
Yep.
But that's exactly what he did, and that's the level of depravity that we're talking about here.
And he almost did it twice.
Almost did it twice. We're going to get into that. Another point I find interesting about this case, if you will, but especially this era of time, is around the same time you got the Ripper murders taking place in London and the hysteria over there. That took place in 1888. A lot of the stuff involving Holmes began just before that time frame and then went past that time frame all the way into like 1893, and I believe all the way to his execution, if I'm not mistaken, was 94 or 96 when he was hanged?
It was 96 when he was hanged.
All right, 1896. So right in the middle of this H.H. Holmes story, you have Jack the Ripper unfolding in that few months period of time in 1888. And of course, there's so much reach to that story, but I just find it interesting that these two stories are overlapping in history.
Yeah, during research for this, I hadn't noticed that. You actually pointed that out, and it makes me wonder.
I'm a big lover of Jack the Ripper especially fiction, but
Yeah.
the story altogether.
It does make me wonder, though, because Jack the Ripper was also kind of a unique thing going
Yeah.
on. It makes me wonder if there was something generationally that could have been happening, but you're also talking about two completely different cultures. It definitely wasn't as connected as it is today, so that's a lot of speculation, and I have no idea if that can even be proven at this point or not.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to find somebody who wrote a book about it, see what they think.
I'm sure, well, I don't know. Maybe we could write that book.
Maybe we should write that book. I don't know.
So, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with his childhood?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start because here we have, again, influences from childhood, just like we talked about last week with Bathory, that I believe set the stage for many things that happen later on with his schemes and his frauds and ultimately his murders. Here's a guy who as a child was bullied. We know that to be true, that he was bullied as a kid, and there were a lot of cases or a lot of incidents of abuse in his early life.
Yeah, and again, some of this is anecdotal, some of it is argued back and forth by a lot of people. There are some people that say the abuse was kind of ramped up in stories after the fact. There's some people that say that it was absolute fact.
Well, and remember, this is an era in history when yellow journalism was at a peak.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of hyper writing going on, hyper journalism.
One thing that we do know is that his mother, and this is similar to another big name in the serial killer or prototype serial killer, if you want to say it something like that, but very similar to Ed Gein.
Yeah.
His mother was very religious, which may have played into some of the fear of mortality that he dealt with as a child. Born Herman Webster Mudgett, not Henry Howard Holmes. He changed his name later on.
Yeah. And he had several aliases that he went by.
A lot. But Herman was, as a child, terrified of death, as anybody is, but he was actually obsessed with it to an unhealthy degree.
Yeah, there was a psychosis because of it.
And many people believe that's partly because of his mother and some of the fear that was probably being put into him from that standpoint. Some people also believe, well, there was a point in his life where classmates were said to have bullied him, and knowing about this fear held him in front of a model or a displayed skeleton.
A skeleton, yeah.
And according to many people, at this point in his life, he went from fear to outright fascination. So this is a major turning point.
With death, with the skeletal remains, with cadavers. I mean, this turned from fear to fascination at this point.
Yeah. This part I would actually put stock in because it's not just like a, ooh, spooky skeleton. He actually did a lot of dissecting of his victims later on in life. So this was something that probably played into his particular brand of sickness, if you will. During his childhood, he was said to have only one friend. There are some people that speculate how that friend ended up. Basically, they were playing in a house one day and the friend fell to his death. And some people question whether or not that was actually his first kill. He did not confess to that later on in life, so it's never been confirmed. It's never been really figured out, but it's something that people have asked over the ages. One other anecdotal before we move into his kind of teenage years and adult years, another thing that people often bring up is that he would kill animals and not so much torture them as dissect them. Maybe torture them, but a lot of people believe that he would kind of pick them apart, do little experiments even as a kid on them just to figure out the inner workings of the body.
Yeah, so that definitely can play into his future. Some of it we're not sure if it is actuality, if it's truth, if it's fact, but there's a lot that lends itself to that history, and that history lending itself to his future. So the guy's messed up from the very beginning.
Yes, and he's very charming from the very beginning as well. Even as a teenager, as a young man, he was known to be... And keep in mind, during this time, it was not necessarily polite to go around touching each other in public as affectionately as he did, but that's something
like hugs and touching, holding hands, and
soft caress of the cheek, that sort
public
of thing, touching
displays
the
of
shoulder.
affection, that kind of stuff. Yeah,
He would do the thing where he would walk up and kind of touch a girl on the arm affectionately, and that was not necessarily something you did with somebody that you weren't explicitly comfortable with, and yet that's something he was known for doing. He was also said to be conventionally handsome, so he had a certain way with wooing women specifically, but also being just an all-around charming person.
Yeah, he's very persuasive, considered to be handsome and well-kept, so there was an ease to kind of slipping into that relational capacity for him.
Yeah. So it was actually at the age of 17 that he married Clara Lovering. Not long after that, they actually had a child together, a son. I believe his name was Robert Mudgett. Interestingly enough, we're from Orlando. He actually went on to become a city manager in Orlando, Florida. Just a tidbit for you there.
His son, or?
Yes, his son.
Oh, wow.
I hadn't known that until recently.
I didn't know that, yeah.
So, just a quick tidbit there for all of our Orlando.
What does that say about Orlando?
Probably it says that the son just wanted to get away from that.
Okay.
That
He just wanted to go to Disney World. Your father has just murdered several people. What are you going to do next? I'm going to Disney World. All right, well, have fun.
But yeah, so he married at a relatively young age, had a kid, and that relationship seemed to be going well at first. But as the years went on, he was getting into college.
I'm going to interrupt you because it's funny that you say that about Orlando. We're going to get into this in a minute, but the whole thing with the World's Fair, it was kind of a blueprint for things like Disneyland and Oz and everything else. People believe there's a lot of inspiration that crossed over from the World's Fair and its layout and its appeal, but it also drove people crazy. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the guy who actually designed the layout of the World's Fair at the time, I believe he went nuts. He ended up in a hospital from losing his head over the stress and the tension caused by his expectations of laying out this World's Fair. There's a lot of stuff that was happening around Holmes during this time period with the World's Fair while he was doing his own thing. Stuff like that, weird, strange stuff. But it's kind of funny that, we say we're going to go to Disney World because there's a little bit of inspiration coming from that time and those events that created some of our grand getaway parks now.
I wasn't aware of the madness aspect. That's interesting to know.
Yeah.
And it may explain why he was able to get away with a lot of stuff.
Well, and that's exactly what. He was able to get away with a lot of stuff. There were a lot of people that went missing from the fair, not just involved with him. The guy who designed the layout, or I forget his exact job title, but that guy went nuts. And there was a lot of stuff like that that was happening at that time in that location. So then you drop in Holmes and the murder castle, and kaboom, you've got a license for some really scary stuff.
We do need to bring that up later for a specific title that somebody gave him in retrospect.
Okay, so he married his first wife at 17. They had a kid. Robert went on to help Orlando. But what happened to Holmes? He left this girl.
He did. He started taking business trips and just trips in general.
Air quotes.
Yeah.
Business trips.
Well, he would take longer and longer trips as well. Around the same time, he was also trying to find employment, and he was also going to his first college. So there was a lot of stuff going on in his life, and at some point, some of the people close to them actually said he started to act violently toward Clara. She actually took their son and moved back to New Hampshire, where they were both from, which honestly was probably to her benefit and to the kid's benefit.
She probably survived because of that move.
Because not everybody survived in the same situation. So he was in college. He, at this point, started, I think, with one teacher. One teacher became a mentor and was teaching him anatomy. He kind of switched colleges somewhere in there and found another mentor that was teaching him dissection. So you have two pretty influencing moments in his life there. He also started stealing corpses, stealing cadavers, and he would resell them disfigured as if he were selling... And let me preface this as well. During that time frame, corpses were not as unsavory as they are today. And what I mean by that is that people, they were in high demand.
Yeah.
People needed them for displays. They needed them for research. They needed them to teach medical school. So he would sell these, and people wouldn't really ask questions back then. They would just...
Well, and I don't know if you mentioned that he was actually a medical student.
Yes. Yeah.
So there were, real potential for connections within that community, which would have made it very easy for him to make those sales. And the selling of cadavers was one of two big schemes that he had going on, the other being the insurance fraud. But it would have been easy for him to have connections and make some easy sales within that community, being that he was a part of it.
That's also where his life insurance scheme started. I'm not entirely sure of the specifics or how he pulled it off, but he confessed before he was hanged that this is where he started that he would take out life insurance and claim it on some of these cadavers, basically make it look like they died in different accidents, and then he would reap the rewards. Again, I'm not sure how he pulled that off legally. Some of the other life insurance schemes in his later life were pretty well documented and figured out, but you see a dual aspect nature of his lying and his con artist craftsmanship, if you will.
Yeah, he was a prolific liar. But here's the crazy thing is that some of those insurance scams equated to hundreds of thousands of dollars in payment to him.
Yeah, and equated, you mean like that's how much it would be in our time?
That's how much it would equate to in our current currency. So you think about selling for several $1,000s. I think one insurance claim it was for like $12,500. I mean, that was hundreds of thousands of dollars in our modern time.
Yeah, so he was making a pretty decent living at that time. Well, not living, but a little fortune on the side.
Yeah, he had a little fortune going.
So college years pass.
We're in the wrong business, Michael. We go talk to some cadavers and see what we can come up with.
I don't know if we could still pull that off in today's
Maybe not.
day and age. So he leaves school, and it's questionable whether he actually got his degree or not, because he was actually, being as charming as he was, he did rub people the wrong way every once in a while, and I guess the records are kind of shoddy whether or not he actually became a doctor. But he definitely portrayed himself that way as life went on. So he found a couple different drugstore jobs. There were a couple missing persons and murder cases, well, not murder cases, but deaths that kind of spooked him, if you will. I think the most notable is he got a job at a drugstore, and there was a boy who died because he took some of the medicine that was prescribed to him from that drugstore. I don't know how his name came up, but Herman Mudgett, still at this time, basically no investigation came up, but it spooked him enough that he changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes, and then he moved to Chicago.
HH Holmes, which, by the way, was paying homage to Sherlock Holmes.
Which I feel like there's a bit of arrogance there. Or if not arrogance, a flair for the theatrical, which we see more in his building of the castle, which is coming up next, actually. So he moves to Chicago in 1886. So I want to point out again, he never divorced Clara, his first wife.
Right.
He just kind of disappeared from their lives. And she actually writes about that later on in her life and says, I hardly ever knew him after that. So they're still legally married. In 1886, 2 years after Clara left him, he actually marries a girl named Myrta Belknap. It's a weird name to say, in Minnesota. And this is before he actually makes the move to Chicago. But they get married. They also have a kid, this time a daughter. He takes still long business trips to Chicago. He finds a job at a drugstore there under the employment of an elderly couple. And he makes himself known as a hard worker, so he's well respected there. Myrta, on the other hand, starts to feel kind of left out. When he's with her, he's a very good, loving person, great father by all accounts, but he's very distant whenever he's gone. So there's a lot of questioning and a lot of frustration there. It should also be noted that her uncle was part of that picture, and he had a lot of questions about Holmes himself. So Holmes comes back, and he convinces the uncle to give him $2,500 to build a house in Chicago for him and Myrta. Well, the uncle is like, okay, maybe he can make this work, so he does so. He gives him the check. Well, Holmes takes that money and he starts his construction on what would be known later on as his castle.
But I believe he also forges
Yeah.
the guy's name for another $2,500.
Ballsy move.
Yeah, so he's got $5,000 in his pocket off of this guy's name at this point, all in a little scheme.
And he starts building this huge castle across the street from.
Did you just call it the Magic Castle?
No.
Okay, it's the Murder Castle. The Magic Castle is a whole other thing altogether.
Yeah, that's true. I don't think
it's the Murder Castle.
I mean, it's late
Maybe you
at
didn't.
Night.
Maybe I'm just hearing things at this point.
So he builds it across the street from the drugstore that he works at.
Yeah.
Now, here's an even ballsier move. He actually invites Uncle Belknap to the castle.
Uncle Belknap. We need to write a story about Uncle Belknap. I just like that name.
He wrote his own story here in a second. So basically, the uncle is reluctant at first. He's reluctant throughout this entire experience, but he actually goes, he checks out the castle, and Holmes, shows it all off, says thank you so much, yada, yada, yada. And then he invites him to see the view from the roof. And for some reason, Mr. Belknap just doesn't feel right about this. So he declines this, says that, he's too old to go up that high. Well,
I believe there was also an interruption. There was a knock at the door or something.
That's what comes next.
Okay.
Holmes insists after this that he stays the night. Belknap again feels bad about this, but he agrees. So he stays the night in his hotel, which is not finished being constructed yet. And at that time, late at night, he hears somebody. He's locked the door, thankfully, but he hears somebody jiggling the door. He sees that somebody's trying to break in. So he calls out and asks who's there. He describes hearing two different people walk away. One person stays at the door while other footsteps leave, and then somebody else leaves after that. So he leaves the next morning feeling pretty spooked. He also finds out after that his signature was forged. And Holmes uses his charm basically to say, I'm sorry, I was just trying to make things right.
Yeah, he's just winning him over.
Yeah. So he avoids being sued or having any legalities pulled over against him by Belknap by his charm. Belknap, for his part, doesn't really put a finger on it until afterwards when, the news is out that, this guy's a psychopathic murderer. And he relates later on in his own memoirs, I guess, that he feels if he had gone up to the roof, he would have never come down.
Yeah, he would have died. He would have been killed up there.
Which makes sense. This is a common thing that Holmes does. He gets somebody to give him what he wants, in this case the money, and then he disposes of them. They disappear.
Yeah, it gets them into a situation they can't get out of, and then they're never seen or heard from again.
So the building of the castle continues, and he's pretty strange about it. He will actually interrupt the construction workers to have them build extra passages.
Yeah, there were tunnels that he was interrupting to build tunnels through that construction.
So all very odd. He would have them include extra gas lines throughout the building.
This whole murder castle is fascinating all to itself. I mean, it's disgusting and horrifying, but it's fascinating.
It's bizarre.
It is bizarre. It's a building that he began to construct and later announced that he was going to use it as a hotel for the 1893 Chicago's World Fair. The construction of it, and I hope I'm going to try to find the photos if I can get the right permission to do so, but I'm going to post some photos on the site or at least on Twitter or something there's some blueprints and layouts of this thing that are available that investigators went back and actually spent weeks drawing out floor plans of this 3-story hotel. First floor had restaurants, drugstore, and a candy shop.
And a glassworks.
Which, by the way, is the excuse used as to why he had kilns in the basement.
Yeah, it was a single, pretty large kiln too. But
it was human-sized at least.
He said, and nobody questioned it because he said, well, I need this for the glassworkers upstairs. Yeah. But we all
Second floor, there were offices and rooms. Third floor was supposed to be used as a very luxurious living space, but he then later said, I'm going to use this hotel to invite people attending the World's Fair. This place was bizarre.
Yeah.
Like you said, it had all these tunnels. He was interrupting construction to have tunnels built. These gas lines would go to specific rooms. They would be airtight almost otherwise. They would be windowless. They would have I think, 51 doorways in it that were open to brick walls. 100 or more of these rooms had no windows, but they had gas lines that were running into the walls. Then, of course, you had the basement with the kilns. He had big vats with lime, quicklime, and he had vats of acid and a dissecting table.
Yeah,
I don't know how you justify the dissecting table. Was that for the candy shop or for the restaurant? I don't know.
I think that part was glazed over for a lot of people. Like they saw the kiln, but they didn't see some of the other stuff.
They just couldn't figure it out. It was so bizarre. People who were building it, even, they said they couldn't figure out what was going on half the time. I mean, staircases that would lead to nowhere.
Very much reminiscent of the Winchester mansion.
Yes. I mean, I was sitting here thinking labyrinth, but I mean...
Yeah, I mean...
just a really bizarre construction.
He designed it in such a way that people would be easily lost, and that he would be the only person who knew exactly how to navigate it. And one of the other things that you would find were that some of those rooms had peepholes into them with his secret passages. So he had that voyeuristic sense about him as well.
Peepholes. Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah.
Sounded like you said peoples.
That too, for as long as they lasted.
I guess so. By the way, this guy has been used in fictional accounts in pop culture quite a bit, and television-wise, I know Supernatural did an episode about his person, about a guy who was buried in concrete and his ghost came back and terrorized women. And I think we read where, I haven't seen this season, but American Horror Story Hotel had a reimagining of HH Holmes in the 1920s as a part of that.
I mean, that's fitting for a hotel. Yeah. So yeah, he's got this bizarre setup going on. And he hasn't necessarily... The thing is, we don't know who the first murderer in that place was. He hired a lot of employees. He had a very high turnover rate. Because of... Especially when the Chicago World's Fair was in play, there were a lot of people that would come to town ready for that. But they were not local to the environment, so they would...
But he also targeted women.
Yes.
He targeted women who were kind of making their way in the world for the first time. He would set up these interviews and promise of, you can choose your own title, make your own way. Mm-hmm. But then he would be like, empty your bank account and bring it with you because you're going to need it to get set up. And then once he got them there, they were prisoners. But nobody could really trace them because they left their home. They came from out of town to him.
And they had part of the whole deal was that a lot of them had to get life insurance under his name.
Yeah. He did this with women looking for a wife too. He would put ads out the same as he would for employment. He would put ads out kind of describing himself as a wealthy bachelor looking for a suitable wife, and he would take interviews, and he basically the whole same thing where come in, let's talk, let's meet, let's get to know each other, bring your bank account, pack your clothes, say your goodbyes, and they'd never be seen again.
Yeah, and it was always easy for him to say, oh, well, whenever he was inquired about where they went, the answer would usually be, well, they went to California or they went to go visit with family. I don't know where they went after that. And if you ever asked him for a forwarding address, it was a statement of, oh, well, they didn't leave that with me. Again, I think in today's era, he would not have been able to do what he did back then, just because we're too connected at this point.
I don't know. There's some weird stuff going on today.
There definitely is. I think he would have pulled off something, but not to the extent that he did.
But he was a smart guy. I think he would have adapted to his environment and to the technology of the day.
True. And maybe it would have been worse for that as well. So maybe it's a better thing that he didn't end up in this era. So all of this is going on. Mind you, he is still legally married to two different women, which is an illegal offense, I believe, in Chicago, but nobody ever figured that out, I don't think. There is a couple that comes in and are quickly employed at the castle, and Alex Connor, and I believe her name was Julia Smith or Smythe, but they are married with their daughter Pearl. They come into the castle and start working for Holmes. Holmes starts to have an affair with Julia. Alex Connor does not pick up on it at first. He's trying to impress Holmes, and he's also trying to impress his wife at the same time, so he starts taking on more and more responsibility. Holmes actually, in a clever twist, offers to make him a kind of a big shot and puts a lot of the business under his name, but Alex quickly finds out that there are a lot of debts that come with that. So he kind of is burned right away, but he can't do much about it because he's legally signed some contracts and everything. And then at that point, you also have people who point out to him that Julia has been having an affair with Holmes. So Alex just kind of washes his hands of the entire deal. He leaves the castle and he tries to take Pearl with him, but can't get custody, so he leaves her behind. Several months later, Julia comes to Holmes and says, "I'm pregnant. Marry me." Holmes says, "Okay, I'll marry you, but on the condition that I perform an abortion." Being a doctor, she trusted him. So they make an appointment for this. She's actually left notes saying, "I'll meet up with you guys," talking to her friends. She's made plans for later that evening and everything, or later that week, I guess. The problem is, after the appointed time of the abortion, Julia and Pearl are never heard from again, never seen again. It is often thought that this was one of the first murders, if not one of the earlier murders, and obviously the bodies could have been discarded via the kiln, via the acid baths, or anything else. But it's interesting to note, during that time, he kind of gets up to his old scheme again. There's a disfigured body that he sells off to another person in the business of cadavers, and that's actually recorded pretty well at that time. It's suspected that that was Julia, but time can never truly tell. So you now have the two women that he did marry, and then this third woman that demanded to be married but quickly disappeared. So you have these events that take place and transpire, and moving forward into 1893, we don't know how many people, again, Holmes did this to. There were quite a few suspected cases, but basically what happens next, you have the Chicago World Fair approaching and eventually starting, and then you have an actress by the name of Minnie Williams. Minnie Williams was a little bit different from the rest. He was after her for a very specific reason. She was actually in ownership of a property in Fort Worth, Texas, that Holmes, it's pretty clear he had his eye on that from the start. So he convinces her to put that property into the possession or sign the deed over to a man named Alexander Bond, which turns out to be one of his many aliases. Her sister actually comes into town to hang out with those two. According to sources at that time, they are presented as man and wife, although I don't think any marriage actually happened. Or if it did, it was very small. But those three are said to have made plans to go to Europe, just a vacation of sorts. Well, that vacation never happens, and Minnie and her sister disappear from the face of the earth. They're never seen again after, I think, July 5th was the date of that year. You now have another missing girl, and you now have Holmes in possession of a fairly large property in Texas. During this whole time, Holmes has been continuing the construction on the castle. I don't think it's ever fully finished, that third floor. But you have a lot of companies that are starting to question why they're not getting paid for the work. You have furniture companies that have supplied him with furniture but never been paid as well. He basically tells them, yeah, you can come get your stuff, but if you make any damages, you have to pay me for the damages to the property. So you have a lot of heads starting to turn, and Holmes actually starts to feel the heat. So in 1894, fast forwarding a little bit, you actually have him arrested for the first time because one of his schemes kind of caught up with him. I think he was selling goods that had already been mortgaged, basically. He's actually in prison for a short time. He comes up with this new scheme to basically, it went through a few drafts, basically, but meeting a person in jail, he and this person figured out that they would fake the death of one of his closest allies, a man named Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was a carpenter and a small-time inventor of sorts. He also did have a criminal record, but he was pretty essential to a lot of Holmes' work at the castle. During all of these years, Pitezel was basically carrying out a lot of his dirtier deeds, disposing bodies, shifting things around. He also had his own list of aliases. Pitezel agrees to this. The three of them say they're going to split the money three ways, basically. And it was going to be a $10,000 insurance fraud that they were going to pull off. He managed to pull it off. What people didn't realize for a while, though, Holmes didn't just fake Pitezel's death. The original idea was for Pitezel to be in the guise of an alias as an inventor. And Holmes was supposed to find just a cadaver and make it look as if the cadaver had died in an explosion. Instead,
and going back, that's one of his schemes that he did with the cadaver scheme in medical school, is he would disfigure them.
Yeah.
And then that's where he would make his insurance claims, that these people had died in accidents, you couldn't really tell who they were, and then he would collect on those claims.
So it's unclear why he jumped plans like he did, but instead of finding a cadaver to blow up, he actually used a lot of chloroform. I think after some trials went on, they dug up the body after time had passed and found that he had actually poured chloroform into Pitezel's stomach. So there was an excessive amount of chloroform, and then he burned the body afterwards, after killing him. So although in the trial he claimed to light him on fire while he was still alive. So we don't know the truth on that, but the fact of the matter is he killed Pitezel instead of just faking the man's death.
Yeah, he had a penchant for not keeping the same storyline.
Yep.
When questioned. He would create new stories and layer those upon layers of lies. And I think to the point where he couldn't even keep up with his own lies, and that eventually caught up with him.
Yeah, he was spinning things left and right, and where he succeeded in that, people were kind of separated. They were isolated. He was very good at that when people were not in the know with each other. But as time closed in on him, and as people started to figure out what was going on, with the schemes at least, that's when things started to crash down around him. So he pulls off the life insurance claim, and Pitezel's wife, who also was aware of what was going on, basically wanted to see her husband. He gave her the runaround, and somehow he convinced her to take this parallel course with him, and they would go and see Pitezel, or at least get closer to him. I think the official story that he gave her was that Pitezel was hiding somewhere in London. Somehow during this time, though, he convinces her to let him take custody of 3 of her children on this trip, and he would guide them, basically. She had 5 children. The youngest and the oldest she kept with her. The other 3 went with Holmes. Unfortunately, on this path, on this journey, he ended up killing all 3 of the kids. The 2 girls he stuffed into a trunk and basically put a gas line in there, and they died from asphyxiation. He cut off one of the girls' feet, I guess because she had a club foot, so it was an identifying mark about her, was the speculation, but he buried them both in the cellar of the house that he was renting at the time. The boy he killed later in Indianapolis, I think like 6 months later or something, and he actually afterward dismembered that body and hid it in different parts. Bits of bone and internal organs were found charred in the chimney. So that horrific event happens, and he's caught not too long after that. Basically, during this time, he had gone down to Fort Worth to visit the same area that Minnie Williams had signed over to him unknowingly. His plan, because things were heating up in Chicago, he was imprisoned, and he no longer felt comfortable there, he wanted to go make another castle in Fort Worth, Texas. The problem was he got a little bit too big for his britches and stole some horses, I believe. And people...
Too big for his britches. You just used that.
I did.
On the Monster Guys podcast.
I did. He got cocky. And
yeah, he did.
You don't do any horse thievery in Texas, apparently. Because they...
Well, and especially not with these people.
Well, that's the thing, is they hired the Pinkerton agency to come after him. And
wrong move, buddy. You crossed the wrong guy.
And what makes it even worse for Holmes was that the particular Pinkerton agent that came after him, the detective was a man who had recently lost his wife and daughter. So there was a personal passion to find the kids that were with him. And he tracked Holmes down. He found the bodies in each location, and Holmes was soon after apprehended in Boston, I believe. So it caught up with him. And around the same time that the horrific news was coming out, people in Chicago started wondering, how long has he been like this? Could he have done anything else like this? So they actually stormed the castle, and they found the labyrinthian building. They went to the basement and found all the tubs of acid and the quicklime, the dissection table. They started looking around for bodies, and they never found any full bodies. What they found were different remains buried here or stuffed up chimneys there, things in the secret passages.
Yeah, one of the things about that castle, I don't think we mentioned earlier, but it had human-sized chutes coming from the different floors that fed into the kiln or fed into that basement area, which was also very bizarre.
Yeah, bizarre and terrifying.
It wasn't just laundry chutes. These were human-sized chutes where bodies were sent down to the basement.
At this point, we're crossing into an almost Vincent Price era movie, but in real life. And it's not comical at that point. It's not spooky. It's downright sickening and terrifying.
Yeah, it's definitely sick.
So Holmes is caught, and he eventually...
That's why we called this Monsters Among Us, Michael.
Is it?
Because these are sick people.
Yeah.
These are monsters. Real-life monsters.
Yes, the worst kind. So the trials do happen. He, interestingly enough, is tried for the murder of Pitezel. After everything else that he had done, it was the death of Pitezel, the murder of Pitezel, that I guess they decided to try him for. And he confessed, as you said before, to 27 other murders. The weird thing about that is that there were people alive that he confessed to murdering.
Yeah, this was during the trial. He confessed to 27 different murders, but they found many of those people still alive.
They did find a few.
So again, it was just layers upon layers of lies and misdirection and storytelling.
So people never really knew the exact body count of Holmes. During that time, though, he was still a money-making fanatic, too. He started writing his own autobiography, and he really hammed it up. The quote that you were talking about earlier, he goes on to say in other times how his appearance since being imprisoned started to become wraith-like, and it changed. You know, his mustache drooped, his cheeks were gaunt. I think he even went on to say that he was taking on the form of horns near his forehead and taking on that appearance of the devil himself.
Yeah, this guy really believed that the devil was in him.
I kind of wondered, did he believe that, or did he sensationalize that?
I believe both. I believe this guy believed that he was possessed by the devil or something like it. That came through his life. That came through his storytelling. That came through his belief, his internal belief, and he externalized it. Like I said earlier, I believe that, he created so many stories and told so many lies that at some point you can't keep track of that. But I think it went beyond that with him. I know people who are just flat out liars. I've known a couple people in my life that are, I just would put them pretty close to being monstrous people. And you can't keep track of that many lies and that many stories. But I believe it went beyond that with him, that he created so many, but he was having fun with it. The stories and the lying and the layers of it all became a part of his narrative. And he enjoyed it. Whether he remembered it or not, whether he contradicted himself or not, the more he did that kind of stuff, I believe the more he enjoyed it, and the more that's what he became. And I do believe that he believed that the devil was in him. But I also believe he enjoyed leveraging that as sensationalism.
It was definitely sensational. You had people that were starting to be really creeped out and fearful of him. I don't believe the title came in till centuries later, when there was an author that was writing the book The Devil in the White City.
Eric Larson.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Chicago was originally known as the Black City because of how dirty it was. During the Chicago World's Fair, it became known as the White City because of the turnaround that they made for that.
Right.
So he became the devil of the White City. But people, after his death, I believe it was, in the castle, there was a gentleman who is kind of still the caretaker of that place, and he ended up taking his own life. And the note that he left behind said, "I couldn't sleep." And I guess he had been having experiences where he believed he was being haunted by the victims that were left behind in that castle. And it makes you wonder whether or not he did experience those. But whether or not he did, there was a huge amount of fear and regret and just bafflement, I believe, at what Holmes did and what he was able to pull off for so long without anybody ever catching him.
Like you said earlier, he had a lot of charm. He had a lot of charisma. He was very persuasive, very handsome, well-kept. He was wealthy, obviously. People might not have known where his wealth came from, but he had it. So, when you're in the presence of something like that, so extravagant, so bright, so full of everything that seems right you're completely in mystery. You have no idea when that light is taken away, when that mystery is resolved, and when that charisma is no longer there, you realize it for what it was or what it is, and it leaves you empty. It leaves you broken. People are broken and empty and destitute in situations like that.
Yeah, I'd imagine you feel very sullied,
It's
very dirtied.
Yeah, it's a whole level of abuse that is just mind-boggling.
So he was put to death. He was hanged, and it was not an easy hanging, I believe. It wasn't a quick snap of the neck. It took, I think, 15 minutes, 20 minutes before they declared him dead.
And this was just, I think, 9 days before his 36th birthday.
Yeah.
When he was hanged. And on the gallows, interestingly enough, still spinning a tale, on the gallows, he declared that he in fact had not killed all those people, but that he had only killed 2 people, and he was only guilty for the lives of 2.
And I think that is a lie that we can put to rest.
Yeah.
But still, it makes you wonder, just, I don't know. I have to wonder if he actually kept records. He was weird. There are a lot of serial killers that are known for their violent acts, and he definitely had a capacity for violence, but he also had a different, I don't want to say style, he had a different method about him. He was very disconnected a lot of the times, stuffing people in trunks or closing them off in rooms and causing them to asphyxiate from a distance. He wasn't always up close and personal. A lot of it was very removed, surgical almost, and that showed. And at the end of his life, he was said to have not feared dying at that point. He made a complete turnaround from his childhood where he was afraid of death, but he was afraid of people dissecting him afterwards. He was afraid of people basically doing the same things to him that he had done to others in life. So he actually demanded, and I believe they actually went through with this, that he would be buried in cement, that he would be encased in cement. And for a long time, people actually thought that because of this, it was fake, that he had actually escaped. I think it was just this year, though, either this year or last, that those remains were actually dug up. Mm-hmm. The cement was opened up, and it was found that his clothes were perfectly preserved from that era. I mean, he was actually hanged and put to death, so he didn't escape. There was no real conspiracy that lasted there. All in all, a truly bizarre case of a monster among us. I mean, a murder castle, something almost out of medieval times.
Yeah, and like you said at the trial, when he requested to be buried in concrete, just strange things like that a part of this. He was buried in 2 tons of concrete.
I didn't realize it was 2 tons.
Yeah,
That's
2 tons of concrete, and there were things that took place during and after his execution that lends to the mystery and the weirdness of it all. It said that there was a lightning bolt that cracked in the sky at the precise moment that he was executed, that he died, and there's another thing called the Holmes curse, and it's believed that he was continuing his murders even after his death. There was a coroner's physician who was a witness in the trial. Shortly after Holmes died, just dropped dead of blood poisoning. There were other people that were involved in the case or in his life that were just dropping dead of mysterious, deadly illnesses that previously had nothing to do with them. They were not diagnosed with, they had no history of. There were a lot of people that were dying in the wake of Holmes' execution, and for whatever reason they were dying, people attributed it to the spirit of Holmes returning and continuing his work from beyond the grave. So you had just an evil man in life doing the deeds that he did, not just in murder, but in scheming and lying and the abuse that he gave to people and, being married to 3 women at one time and everyone...
Without them knowing it.
Without them knowing it, and every one of them being abused and having to flee for their lives, if they survived at all. Then after the death, with these mysterious illnesses and people dropping dead, I mean, there's certainly an air of evil mystery about this guy.
Yeah, like I said, we had questions about the truth behind all of the goings-on with Elizabeth Bathory. There's a pretty solid case against her committing a lot of crimes, but it's still questioned by a lot of historians. This guy, it's not questioned. It's questioned how much, but not the nature of it.
Yeah, to add to the weirdness, he met with 2 Catholic priests while he was in prison, unrepentant to the very end, would not ask for forgiveness of his sins, but received communion with them while in prison. I'm not sure that was right, but nonetheless.
How exactly
how
was
did that
that
work
processed?
out? But the fact is that he remained unrepentant to the end. What's even stranger is later on, one of those priests ends up dead in his backyard sometime after Holmes's death by a mysterious death. I mean, it just keeps on going and going and going. And then, of course, we have his influence in pop culture today. He's certainly not forgotten. And a lot of stories, books and movies and films about him even today. So very influential, but depraved and sick individual.
Definitely. Again, a bizarre entry for this week's Monsters Among Us.
It is. I'll leave with that quote once again. If you want to speak to us, you can find us at themonsterguys.com, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just look us up there. We're on YouTube now, but here's that quote for you once more to leave you from HH Holmes himself. "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil one, standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since." Good night.
Good night.